get started now. Thank you all for coming. I'm Mary Ward and welcome to our big tent. We're gonna, in a few minutes, people will finish signing on, but in the meantime, for any newcomers with us tonight, let me give you some background about our organization. Big Tent was founded in 2019 by a small group of suburban women with one goal in common: to help restore decency and good governance in Washington. We hoped that by creating an active and approachable community, we could learn together how to become more mindful citizens, actively engaged in policies that we care about. Our Big Tent welcomes all. We now have just shy of 1,300 members in 28 states and 8 countries who rely on us as a trusted source of information and civil dialogue. To learn more about our events and those of our partners, please go to bigtentusa.org and join us. We promise not to spam you or to share your name. Our next event is this coming Tuesday, June 22nd at noon. We call those a tent talk. They're daytime. And we will hear from a group called Down Home North Carolina. Co-founder Bridget Flaherty and co-director Dreama Caldwell will tell us about their efforts to grow the good in small towns and rural communities by organizing working people in North Carolina to build power and strengthen democracy within their own communities. Sign up using the link in the chat box, and also keep an eye on your email inbox for the official invitation coming very soon. Now let's get started with our program tonight. Again, I'm Mary Ward, and Big Tent is delighted to host 2 deeply respected journalists, Andrea Bernstein and Dominique Browning, to discuss journalism in the age of TikTok and its role in the future of American democracy. First, let me introduce tonight's moderator, Dominique Browning, whom we Big Tenters know well as a dedicated environmental protection advocate and co-founder and director of Mom's Clean Air Force. These accomplishments follow her decades-long career in the magazine world, including a long stint as editor-in-chief of House and Garden. What you may not know is that back in the 80s, Dominique began her career in journalism at Newsweek, then owned by the Washington Post, where she broke the glass ceiling in becoming the first woman assistant managing editor of any of the news magazines in the US. Andrea Bernstein, a longtime and regular contributor to NPR, has covered 6 national elections, which would take us back to the Clinton years, and her beats have included government, politics, transportation, environment, housing, and policing. She's covered a host of politicians, from Hillary Clinton to Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg to Andrew Cuomo, Eliot Spitzer to Bill de Blasio, and her investigative reporting on Chris Christie's Bridgegate scandal won WNYC News its first ever Peabody Award. In addition, Bernstein was co-host of the award-winning podcast Trump Inc., a joint reporting project from WNYC and ProPublica that invited listeners to follow along with her team as they investigated unanswered questions in real time about the Trump family's financial dealings. And in her spare time, she authored the New York Times best-selling financial thriller, American Oligarchs, the Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power, which has been described as required reading for every democracy-loving American. We are so fortunate to have these 2 journalists who are both passionate about our country, its policies, and its path forward to share with us their insight into how Americans can find common truths in this age of fractured attention and fuzzy information. Before I turn tonight's program over to Dominique, a few quick housekeeping points. There is a live transcript option at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so you can toggle it on to see real-time speech to text. And as a reminder, please put your questions for Andrea and Dominique in the chat box. Now to you, Dominique.
Thank you, Mary. And Mary, thank you also for making this evening possible. I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be talking to Andrea, who has been a trusted source for me. I sat in my apartment in Washington Heights watching traffic back up on the George Washington Bridge one morning, and then I saw helicopters and newscasters, and it was your voice that that told me what was really going on. So for, I think, an entire generation of us, your cohorts, you have been a trusted voice. So when I thought about this evening, I thought there are three themes that thread through your work and certainly through your book. And I'd like to hit on each one of them. The first is truth. The second is trust. And the third is hope. So let's start with truth. You're a journalist. I've been an editor for many years. We are in a world now where the idea that there is a truth is somewhat in question. I deal with this all the time in the climate denier world, and there's an onslaught of disinformation, and there are mechanisms for how this works, and we're watching it in the Arizona fraud that's unfolding right now. You create a false set of facts, you get media coverage, and then you harness all that doubt and propaganda, and you use it. Tell us how you see the mechanisms of disinformation and how you maintain your moral compass on truth and get to that.
So let me just say thank you, Mary. Thank you, Big Tent. Thank you to everyone who is participating tonight. I can't imagine after 15 months of Zoom that people would choose this over their beautiful June evening, but thank you for coming. One of the first ones I did about a year or so ago, I gave a book talk to a library, and people were, microwaving their dinners and talking to each other and sort of coming up and popping up. So hopefully we've all learned a lot about Zoom since then. So now on to the truth. I mean, this is something that I feel like, we really started as a society really grappling with in the run up to the 2016 election in a big way. I mean, I don't want to suggest that the signs weren't there beforehand, but I think what we all learned in 2016 was that the sort of sense that there was a consensus that formed the basis for politics in the broad sense in terms of political action really had begun to fray. And the 2016 election was sort of a symptom of that versus the cause, the sense that people could pick and choose the facts they wanted. So what could be the response to that? Well, a response could be to argue against that. For me, as a journalist, the response really was to document. And what are the facts that we can unearth that tell a story? And can we describe what we're seeing? Not just sort of seeing with our eyes, but seeing in documents, seeing through reporting. Can we build a world that keeps adding to itself in terms of knowledge? And it was incredibly difficult to do in the Trump administration for a variety of reasons. One is it was an administration extremely hostile to disclosure. There were obviously many court cases about turning over documents to Congress. The Manhattan District Attorney, who is investigating Trump, had to go to the Supreme Court twice to get documents to even continue his investigation. And people were very afraid because it was obvious, you could see on Twitter what the former president would do when people disagreed with him. So it was in that environment that we set up this cooperative reporting project, Trump Inc., which involved, as Mary said, not just two news organizations, WNYC and ProPublica, but a wide variety of journalists who work cooperatively and also citizen journalists. And obviously, and people would sort of say to me along the way, what is the point? People are not going to believe what you do anyway. Well, there's only two choices, give up or keep going. So we kept going, and we are keeping going because I think the idea is sort of we keep nurturing this heart of a facts-based society, an evidence-based society, and keep the embers burning. And at some point, the light will flare up again, but sort of the role of journalists and scholars and scientists in this era, is to just sort of keep that notion that there is this fabric that we share alive.
How do you cut across tribal lines? How do you, and I don't mean to imply that it's unimportant to speak to the tribe of people who trust you, but how do you make efforts to reach beyond that and convince the unconvinced?
So it may surprise you, but I don't actually think of myself as speaking to anybody. I think of myself as speaking to everybody. And it is in the receipt of that people may make divisions, but I honestly believe that if you continue to be honest, be fair, to relate a set of facts, that at some point it is sort of not, this sort of self-perpetuating ball of facts for one group and then for another group. I mean, I realize that is the reality in which I'm working, but at the same time, I assume that anybody can receive the information that I am putting out there. And, one of the things I feel particularly sort of early on in our coverage of the Trump administration, people would say, well, but is it a crime? And what difference is it going to make? And, in fact, some of the things may be crimes, we may be learning, but it was never the motivation to create something, because for me, the sense of telling the stories, developing the narratives, standing up the facts, that in itself is a thing, that is an action, that is a predicate for all the other actions. So lots of people do things in different kinds of ways, but that is what I see my role as.
Were there techniques that you learned or honed just in covering Trump? Did your methods of reporting change through that administration in any way?
Yes, I mean, very much so, and in a number of ways. One is, and it's something that the late, great journalist Wayne Barrett taught me. He was the first biographer of Trump, who wrote his biography of Trump, I believe in 1992, when it was called Donald Trump, The Deals and the Downfall. And Trump's spokesperson called him up and he said, I think you should change the title because he's coming back. And Wayne said, okay, I'll change it in the next edition. And he did. So it became Donald Trump, the greatest show on earth. But one of the things he once told me when I was sort of very new at journalism was, you never know who's going to speak to you, and you never know who I speak to. And I have found that words to live by. You just never know who is going to pick up the phone and answer your question. So you have to keep trying. And that was, hard to do in the Trump administration, and easy to assume people wouldn't want to talk to you. But the, sort of number one thing I tell new journalists is don't assume somebody won't talk to you. You just never know. I think the other thing with Trump was that there were a lot of unknowns. And so obviously you want to get the most of the knowable world you can by speaking to as many people as you can, but also acknowledging the sort of, you're not going to have absolute certainty about anything in the way you might have in an administration that was so withholding, and the people around it were so withholding, and an administration that I think told, by the Washington Post tally, certainly over 20,000, maybe over 30,000 lies. I mean, it was an administration where the person at the head of the administration just lied as a form of power, as a way to be able to say, I can define the truth and you can't. So in that context, the only way to work against it was to really, 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 A, talk to as many people as possible, and B, to explain, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. Because if we tried to get things to a point of certainty, we never would have said anything. And clearly the administration knew that and tried to use it against us. So our recourse was only to, keep saying, okay, well, here, blah, we know all these things. Here's a few things we don't know. And here's how we tried to find out the answers. And we'd like to know the answers. And there were many times where people would tell us things that we didn't know at the time. I mean, the other thing is that I was recently speaking to a former prosecutor and asking how, if there is going to be a tax case against Trump in Manhattan, how would a prosecutor deal with an unreliable witness like Michael Cohen, who was, after all, convicted of lying? And he said, well, what we would say is, we did not choose Mr. Cohen, Mr. Trump did. So in our pursuit of trying to get people around Trump to speak with us, we understood these were unreliable narrators, but that's what we had to work with, because those were the people that Trump had chosen to work with. And that's why we were speaking to these people, some of them who were in fact convicted liars.
That's actually a really good, that's a good life lesson. You never know, we're going to learn something. It is true that Trump did not cause this breakdown in trust and in truth, but the Trump administration really was a seismic shift, right? I mean, as a journalist, what you've seen over the arc of your career has certainly changed quite radically. And, you know, I think about how the good side is that the gatekeepers have loosened their grip, the old gatekeepers of the media, who gets to talk, who gets to report. But there's been a flip side, which is truthiness, I guess. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's indisputable that Trump caused so much damage while he was president by simply not telling the truth, by disregarding science, by, like, you know, I mean, saying easily disprovable things, like it's a beautiful day today when it was raining. I'm not saying he said that, although he probably did, but there were so many things like that, that it had an obvious corrosive effect. And he's still obviously doing it now. I mean, he's been deplatformed from most social media, from all social media, so far as I know. I mean, he still has his website. People still can tweet about him, but he cannot sort of go out and say things in the way that he could. But I mean, we can see the damage where something as basic in a democracy as accepting the results of an election, I don't know what the latest polls show, but a significant portion of Republican voters believe that Biden was somehow fraudulently elected. And this was something that Trump has promoted, is still promoting, and it is a real warning sign for democracy. That when, you know, I still remember when Hillary Clinton conceded and she and Bill came out and they were wearing purple, and they were sort of like, we have to give the president, you know, the newly elected president-elect our best wishes for success, because, you know, all of us count on that. And that was the last time we heard anything like that on a national level. And I think that that's very bad. You know, the sort of strategy of this administration seems to be, okay, we're just going to do the good policy, and therefore people will, you know, we'll sort of win people over. I think the jury is very much out on whether that will actually occur. But without a doubt, Trump has done and is doing a great deal of harm to democracy.
I just got muted. I've just unmuted myself. Well, on that, Kitty Douglas raises a question. It took a long time for the press to use the word lie, and now we are at the big lie. Do you think that the press is doing a good job right now reporting on the big lie?
I do. I think people have been pretty careful, really since November 3rd, to say Trump has said without evidence, Trump has said this lie, Trump has said this thing about the election. That did not happen with the same amount of diligence prior to the election. But I think people were very, very alarmed about what would happen if they didn't start saying that. I mean, I think that, you know, one of the things that is a particular genius of Trump is he uses the rules of the game against people. So he understood that sort of a good portion of the journalism world was not going to want to call him a liar because it would seem like they were somehow taking sides. And he rode on that for a long time until it became so obvious that there was no other word to call these things. And the Washington Post developed a new term for him. They have their one Pinocchio, two Pinocchios. They had a bottomless Pinocchio, which was a lie that they kept correcting and he kept repeating. And obviously the lie about the election results is probably the biggest bottomless Pinocchio of them all.
How alarmed are you about this current lie about these audits, these fraudits, as they are nicknamed, which are now happening in certainly more places than Arizona? Actually, really, how alarmed are you as a citizen as well as a journalist?
Well, I mean, I haven't really been covering the sort of events in Arizona in a real direct way, but I do think that, my book is called American Oligarchs. And I mean, aside from being about this sort of Trump and Kushner family story, which are actually extremely gripping and dramatic stories, I promise, the book is about the slide of democracy and the influence of money in politics, and how there's been this sort of dance or sort of race to the bottom, where as inequality increases, more money enters the political system, and it becomes more about the powerful people influencing the system to get the results they want. And what we are seeing now is a sort of even further step in this direction, which is, it's not we're going to influence the system using money, it's we're going to say the system itself is unreliable. And in the epilogue of my book, I sort of quote Hannah Arendt from her article Truth in Politics. And it's about how the enemy isn't that people misconstrue facts. The enemy to a democracy or even a civilized society is the idea that there is no common truth. And once you have that, all kinds of horribles can happen. So I think that getting down to the very basic unit of an election and saying, I didn't get the results that I want, so I'm going to challenge them, even though these things have already been counted and recounted and recertified by Democrats and Republicans alike, and Republican elected officials, not only in Arizona, but all around the country, have repeatedly shown why these results stand up, it is a grave danger and something that people really should be alarmed at, and not just think of it as a sideshow.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, this does lead us to the second theme of trust. And I'm wondering whether in the course of your thinking about this American oligarchy, you felt or noticed or reported on in a lot of texture, a kind of breakdown over generations in this trust in a common decency and a common...
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I don't know that I really sort of traced the trust gap. Mm-hmm. But I do think that it is something that we are, really dealing with. And I want to be careful because, obviously in the sort of good old days of trust, things were awfully bad for an awful lot of people. So I want to be sort of, careful, because those were periods where all kinds of people were excluded. And it's easier to have a sort of singular discourse when you have only a certain kind of group of people that is allowed to speak. So I want to be careful about that, but I do think things were really different when people got their news everybody got their news from Walter Cronkite, mm-hmm. or most people did, mm-hmm. Versus this sort of fractured news environment where people can literally just sort of choose who they want to believe and who they want to ignore.
Well, so is it a question of sort of reassembling around different trusted sources? And, you know, as we know in any relationship, trust is something that's built up over time. Do you think of your audience, your readers, the people who listen to you as people with whom you're building trust? How do you think about trust?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that's sort of the flip side is that, you know, there's an awful lot of people who do want to know the truth and feel grateful for sort of storytelling, research, you know, who thank me. So, you know, the sort of, I think that is, and I think it's something that, you know, I'm particularly seeing, since, you know, Trump, which is that people are somewhat less afraid to speak. And so I do have a sense that, you know, that's sort of not just a Sisyphean or pointless endeavor, you know, trying to continue to tell the kinds of stories that matter and that sort of get at the sort of issues of accountability and democracy that we are dealing with now.
I've been reading some interesting polling about the news sources that people trust. And even as we're seeing a decline in local news reporting, people's feelings about their local news sources have become warmer. They trust them more. So I'm wondering how you think about that.
It's funny. It's like how everybody hates Congress except for their member of Congress. Yeah. You know, I don't know what to think about that. I don't know that I've sort of thought about it in sort of like the meta, that kind of a meta way. You know, except that, you know, I mean, there's a real hunger for this information. You know, my book was a bestseller, our podcast was a big hit. I mean, people really do want to know. So I feel that, you know, I'm not sort of how the trust issue breaks down, but I do feel like people actually, there is a sizable non-depressing amount of society that believes that good journalism is worth it.
Yeah.
And you know, good journalism has created so many changes. You know, just, I mean, my former colleagues in ProPublica just last week had this story about taxes and people's personal, you know, the billionaires' personal tax returns. And I thought to myself, oh, okay, here's another story about how the rich don't pay taxes. But what really hit about that is they had the goods, they had the receipts, they had the numbers. And all of a sudden in Washington, there's this discussion about should there be a wealth tax? And that was so much a part of my book, and particularly in the Trump and the Kushner families, and how from generation to generation, they worked so hard to pass along their wealth in a way where they wouldn't have to pay taxes, where they wouldn't have to give back to the very societies that undergirded their real estate endeavors. I mean, real estate, those of you who live in New York know, is not something that just you happen to be successful. You're successful at it because government supports you. So government supported, you know, with subways and roads and tax abatements and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet when it came time to paying the tax man, these families were, you know, just did everything they could to avoid, including committing crimes. I actually had a discussion with a former prosecutor about now whether Charlie Kushner has been pardoned. He is still a criminal, but apparently technically you are still a criminal, even if you've been pardoned by the president. And what is astounding to me is that all of a sudden there's just a discussion in Washington, should there be a wealth tax? Well, that's an amazing thing. And that is something that journalism made happen just last week. Now, I'm not saying there's gonna be a wealth tax, but the fact that people are actually talking about a tax that's not just about an income tax, but about this tremendous amount of money that people like Bloomberg and Bezos and you know, all of these billionaires have is really a remarkable thing. And it says something about the power of journalism.
Do you think that the way the 2022 election is covered is going to change? Sue Mandel asks that.
Well, it's an interesting question. You know, I myself, I know it seems like it, but I haven't actually done election coverage since 2016. Mm-hmm. So the answer is, I just don't know. And I sort of think that, you know, one of the things I'm of two minds, because in one way, if you don't cover elections in a way that suggests, okay, the results are going to be accepted, you're really in trouble. On the other hand, what happens if you don't acknowledge that there is this sort of fight over, you know, a very visible fight now, not over whose vote counts, but over what the results actually mean. I'm not sure what the end game is there.
Interesting. You mentioned Hannah Arendt. Is there a book that you would recommend this group take a look at?
I mean, there sort of, I think, depends on, you know, what you're interested in. Right now, I'm reading Sarah Schulman's book, Let the Record Show, which is about the AIDS crisis, which is this 800-page book, which I am actually really happy to dive into, about what happened in the 1980s. And I think that it's just been terrific. I mean, I love anything that Masha Gessen writes. And I also strangely enjoy a lot of people's political biographies, even though you'd think I would be bored. So I did enjoy Barack Obama's, you know, sort of very long memoir, not just because it was a sort of interesting view into a period in time that took place immediately before the period that we're in. And for me, that was very, very important for people to look into. And, you know, everything by Jane Mayer is great, and everything by Bob Caro is great. Read it all. Like, I feel like sort of Bob Caro is the original accountability journalist and sort of the, you know, kind of prince of biography in whose footsteps we all follow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, and you're mentioning people who are really ringing the alarm bells as, you know, having absorbed a lot of the lessons that Arendt taught us about the rise of fascism and what happens and how that can creep in insidious and almost unseen ways. So I'm interested that you are obviously really versed in that as well.
I want to be clear, and you know, my book, for those who haven't read it, starts in the Holocaust, and with the Kushner family and particularly his grandmother, Ray Kushner's experience of the Holocaust. And I just read another book about the Holocaust, the New Judy Battalion book, which is also wonderful. Mm-hmm. But we're not in that period. We are not experiencing mass death. We are not experiencing people being shot on the street. You know, we're not there. However, we are also in this very sensitive period for democracy, where we can sort of choose to knit it together again or go in another direction. And sort of that, I think, was really what my book was meant to be a story about, was about sort of, you know, what happens when you keep corroding these institutions and accepting it and then normalizing it. And that is something I think that we really need to be on guard against.
And I think what's really unnerving today is that even if majorities choose not to go that way, there's still something wrong with the system. So that, yeah.
Yes, I mean, clearly, you know, a lot of work needs to be done. And, you know, I also just want to be, you know, speak out in favor of common ground, because I think there's a vast array of people in the political spectrum who sort of have given up on that. And so I would make a plea for sort of common underground, common understanding, and, you know, not always going to the worst thought about the person or group with whom you may be disagreeing at the moment, because sort of, I just can't imagine we can ever coalesce as a society in that, under that circumstance.
Well, so then on that note, I think, do you feel like President Biden is doing the right thing in trying to corral bipartisan action, or is that quixotic?
You know, I just I don't know that I'm the right person to ask about that. I mean, I think that, that is definitely their strategy. I also think their strategy is to move forward. Their strategy is sort of, if we keep thinking about the past, then we'll be stuck on the past. I honestly don't know as a citizen if that is the right thing to do or not. With sort of, one of the things I felt was sort of particularly powerful after Biden was inaugurated was that people essentially were saying in some form or another, Democrats, I never want to think about Trump again. And I don't think that's a good solution either, because I think there's a lot that we still don't understand what will happen in his presidency and about the effect he has. And that if we just sort of allow that to go away, then we will sort of, we're not going to get out of it. It's kind of like putting a bandage on a wound that never quite heals.
What kind of things are you looking at that you think we haven't really absorbed yet, or even haven't been reported enough yet?
Well, I mean, I think that, sort of one of the things that, disturbs me is a sort of recent breakdown of talks about a 9/11 style commission about January 6th. I think that, the sort of, the range of disagreements in Congress, I do think that there are some, on the one hand, you can look at the fact like, okay, 57 senators voted to impeach the president is a remarkable consensus. Not enough to sort of actually convict him, but a real statement that, or that, some number of House members, or that 35 Republicans in the House voted to establish this kind of commission, the 9/11 style commission. So I think that on the one hand, you can sort of look at that and say, okay, there's, is sort of movement. But, if you listen to the debates, it can be pretty dispiriting in Congress. So I just don't know if Biden's strategy is the right or wrong one. And I'm sort of thankfully not in a position where I have to say anymore. So.
Well, there you go. Are there things you're looking at besides the wealth tax as a reporter that look like interesting possible solutions or avenues to explore?
I've been spending a lot of my time really following the legal cases against Trump, so it's a bit more backward looking than that. I've been following the Manhattan DA's investigation, the New York AG's investigation. There are a number of cases arising from January 6th. There's the Georgia investigation. There are various defamation lawsuits that, the E. Jean Carroll lawsuit, the Summer Zervos lawsuits. I've been following a lot of those legal cases. And, I think it's going to be a real test for the rule of law in our society about whether we sort of get to a reckoning over these various infractions. And one of the things that's so remarkable about Trump is he just managed to figure out all the ways to stay ahead of the law. And we may be in a period where that is ending. So I haven't really been sort of focused so much on kind of policy as I have been looking at those cases.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and one wonders whether he is hardwired or whether that generation of growing up in the real estate world trained him to be a step ahead.
Don't know what's going to happen with these legal cases, which makes it extremely fascinating.
Yeah. Well, actually, that moves us to the subject of hope. Although one more question just on reporting techniques. Is it very different reporting for a podcast than it is reporting for anything else? Are you finding quirks or?
Not really. I love working in long form. I loved writing a book, although I hated the process of writing the book, but I loved the idea of, sort of thinking about the long arc of an idea, and a podcast allows you to do that, but the reporting is the same. It's sort of looking at documents, calling up people, corroborating, all of those things that you do, sort of figuring out who that can shed light on something. So that is not different at all. It's just a different way of telling stories. And, I think that, podcasting had a big explosion during the pandemic. I think it was the podcast, from a production standpoint, it didn't really change so much. unlike, say, movies or TV, because you could do so much remotely. And, you know, people had, I don't know, more time on their hands in their houses folding laundry or whatever, so cooking, so they could listen to podcasts. So I think it's a question of, it's sort of, you know, it's satisfying to be able to tell a story in its fullness. But the reporting itself is quite similar.
Same thing. Yeah, interesting. Let's talk a little bit about hope. Mary Ward pointed out that it is the last word in your book.
Yeah.
First of all, was that purposeful, or did it just so happen that way?
It was purposeful. And you know, I thought about it a lot because I wanted, you know, I wanted the last word to be hope, particularly because so many of the things I wrote about were, you know, kind of upsetting. But, you know, I thought a lot about what is hope. And I said, I can't just, you know, it would be really dishonest to write a 400 plus page book, which people should still read. It's a riveting narrative, I promise. But to have written a long book and then get to the last word and say, okay, despite what I said, be hopeful, right? Like that would be so, it would break a compact with the reader.
Yeah.
So I thought to myself, well, what do I mean by hope? And, you know, to me, hope is not a, it's not a sort of, it's not the same as optimism. It's just a question of how you are being in the world. And so long as I am doing the thing that I do, which is reporting and writing and, you know, trying to tell the truth, that's an action. And that is hope. If I gave up on all of that, that would be without hope. And that's why I felt like I can end this book with the word hope, because by still being in the world, by still engaging in the world, by addressing the world, I am still being hopeful about the world.
That's really quite beautiful. Hope is how you are greeting the world or meeting the world, addressing the world. You know, working on climate change issues, on global warming issues, climate chaos issues, it is often very, very difficult to think about issues of hope. But of course, the alternative is give up. That's not an alternative. And so I spend a lot of time myself thinking about where is the hope. And of course, ultimately, the hope is in continuing the action of trying to change things, or in your case, continuing the action of reporting the truth, believing that there is such a thing as truth, and creating a common space for people to convene. And I think this entire big tent idea is really about the hope that there can be civil discourse and what I call it, Mom's Clean Air Force, old-fashioned habits of citizenship.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, on that, do you ever feel that there's a kind of blurry line between your repertorial self and your, you know, come on, we've got to make change self, or do you struggle with that at all?
You know, to me, the action in the world is the journalism. And for me, and so I I think it goes back to that issue of sort of the what difference does it make? It's like, I can't answer that, but I can keep doing what I'm doing. So therefore I do. And, you know, I feel like it's in the response that an answer to that is developed.
Interesting. Susan Lehman asks a question that is really quite provocative, and I think about it myself a lot. Do you feel that the media, you know, writ large, ignores good news of progress? I mean, Jim Fallows basically wrote a whole book about this, which I recommend to everybody, by the way. But how do you think about that?
Well, it reminds me of a conversation I once had with at a family dinner with a friend of mine who works at the New York Times, and I think that my dad was saying, you know, the media does this, and I was at the New York Times, and I was like, it's so unfair to blame the New York Times. And then I can't remember, something came up, and I, you know, and I was like, for that you can blame the New York Times. You know, it's sort of like, I feel like I mean, I think the concept of the media is too general, the concept to really answer that question. And, you know, sort of who is responsible for that? I don't know. I mean, it's also complicated because I do think that in some ways, you know, take climate. I mean, climate's a good example. I mean, I think sort of, you know, there's a sense that conveyed, yeah, really everything's going to be okay. Okay, like the stakes are very high, but things are going to be okay. And obviously, if you look at the science, like that kind of attitude is a problem. So I think that there is a, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, I think that, you know, the media means all kinds of things, and the sort of good news, bad news means all kinds of things. And that might be a, you know, a sort of the wrong way of looking at things. I think it's better to sort of look at, you know, how things are covered and what they are based on, and how the facts are gathered.
Mm-hmm. How can Big Tent members here support honest journalism?
Well, I mean, subscribe. You know, I think it is really, really important to, you know, to buy the books, to subscribe to the newspapers, to pay the fees. You know, people have a constant stream of information coming in and don't necessarily want to pay for more of it. Mm-hmm. But in this case, you know, you will get what you pay for. So I think that honestly is the answer. Like, you know, I mean, I just try to buy a lot of books. Even when people give me books, I buy books. And you know, I subscribe to a lot more publications than I can ever read, but it's because I think that, you know, it's important to support the work that these people are doing, and that is how it is supported.
Yes, I can see that. I'm going to ask you a question that John Cooper has asked, but I do not know what happened today. What are your thoughts on the actions of Caitlin Collins at CNN and the reactions of POTUS today?
I don't know either what happened today. So.
Okay. All right, we will skip that. I did not spend the day glued to my computer, I confess, so I'm not conversant either. Let's go back to your career. You are diving into the podcast world. Are there things for all of us fans? Are there things we should be looking out for, or how are you thinking about the next stage in your career as the next stage of journalism reveals itself?
I mean, you know, I think there's a lot of different things that are happening in journalism. I mean, I think that we're in just sort of storytelling more broadly. I mean, what's interesting to me is that at the same time that, you know, we're sort of all getting our news in little bits and bytes and tweets and news alerts, there's a demonstrable desire by people to sink into stories. So I think, you know, we see that in the sort of incredible rise of television subscription services. And, you know, I think that the book industry took a hit for a while during the pandemic, but then people really went back to reading. People really do want to sink into these full stories. And to me, that is very encouraging, because it says that there's a real space to tell these sort of important long stories where people just really sort of gather around the hearth and listen or watch, but, you know, in my case, listen. So I feel very actually encouraged by that. And I think that, you know, I worked in radio for so many years, and you know, if you tell me to say something in 40 seconds, I can do it, or 35, like I just automatically do it, but I'd rather not be the victim of that clock. And, you know, there's a sort of, in the public radio world, they call it hitting the post, when you like get to the break on time and you don't step on the next thing that's coming. So it's a relief to not always hit the post, even though it's a sort of, you know, it's like sticking the landing in gymnastics. When you hit the post, you're really happy you did it. But it is, you know, sort of wonderful, freeing thing that the audience is there for kind of sort of more relaxed form of storytelling, and that there are people who want to do it, and there is all of these sort of new spaces to do it. I mean, in some ways, it's just sort of the golden age of audio. There are not only the established public radio stations, but all kinds of, different podcasting houses putting out content that is really good and people want and do listen to.
Well, tell us some of your favorite podcasts. I mean, what are you recommending?
Well, I really like the podcast Wind of Change that Patrick Radden Keefe did last summer, which was on the song Wind of Change, and whether the CIA wrote that song. It's really a podcast about cultural hegemony. I liked all the Slow Burn and Fiasco series. I loved the Atlantic series Floodlines, which was about Katrina. It was extremely lyrical. I've just started to listen to the new podcast, which I think is exclusive to Apple, which Apple put out, called The Line. And I also just, listen to a lot of everyday stuff. Like I listen to Fresh Air almost every day because I think Terry Gross is, so brilliant. I listen to the Brian Lehrer Show in podcast form. I listen to Today Explained from Vox. So it sort of depends on what I'm doing and whether I want to, it's like, do I want to settle in and read a book, or do I want to sort of listen to a newspaper article? So I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Yeah, what's The Line?
The Line is a podcast about the Navy SEAL Gallagher, who was court-martialed for murdering an Iraqi. And what makes it so fascinating is they really interview a lot of Navy SEALs and really get inside that culture, which I think is a sort of, otherwise a very insular culture. And to me, that is a real power of podcasts, that they can bring you into a world that you may not know about. And because it's such an intimate form, audio, you really feel like you become immersed and know this world in a way that you didn't before.
Wow, fantastic. Are you thinking about a next book?
I mean, not yet, but I mean, in a general sense, yes, I would like to write another book, but, having now understood what that takes and means, it's like, I have to make sure that I really want to live with it for a number of years, because it is it's a wonderful thing to write a book, and also the hardest thing I ever did.
Well, and you are such a meticulous reporter. What is it, 44 pages of endnotes in your book? So although it's probably like a lot of things, like if you knew what you were getting into, you probably wouldn't do it. And so therefore it's better not to know.
Yeah, but I would do it. It's something I wanted to do. I liked writing it, and I liked having written the thing. And I liked, the book in its original draft was, I think, maybe 200 or 250 more pages. And I, once had an editor who said, if you put everything in and people get bored, who cares what brilliant thing you have to say? Because they've stopped reading, they stopped listening. So I just cut a lot of things out. I can't even remember what I cut out. But at the end of the day, people want a great yarn. They want a great story. They want a great read. Almost all of the Trump books are really impossible. And I was like, I want to write a book that people will read while Trump is president and after he's president and for years to come, because I want it to be a book that tells the story of our time in a way that's a really satisfying read, and that, you just want to turn the pages, because that's how I like to read. It's sort of like, I don't want to eat my Wheaties or whatever, grape nuts any more than anybody else does. Now I'll get all the Wheaties and grape nuts fans coming at me. So
I spent most of my nighttime during the pandemic reading Dickens, and one thing about your book is that it does have that 19th century quality of a big overarching life that you cover.
Yeah. And also the characters. I mean, it's like I didn't, Rudy Giuliani, who when I started writing the book, I did not know when I started writing that he was going to come back in Act 5, which, had to do with Ukraine. I had no idea. Same thing for like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone. I mean, they just sort of kept coming around. And I literally did not know that that was going to happen. And I think it, tells you something about history and storytelling, that there were these, sort of incredible twists and turns that no one could have predicted, and I certainly did not when I sat down to write.
Well, so let's end on a prediction. What do you think is going to be the most surprising development in, let's just say, 3 years?
Oh, I don't know. I stopped predicting on November 9th, 2016. So I don't know. I think that the most surprising thing is that whatever it is, we couldn't possibly anticipate it tonight.
Yes, that's actually probably a very good life lesson as well.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much, Andrea and Dominique. This was fascinating, and I'm sure we could all sit here and listen to you all night long. But as Andrea noted, it's a beautiful June night, and we all should go out and get a cocktail and enjoy the evening. So thank you all for joining us tonight. As always, there's going to be a recording of the program available on our website. Should you have any friends who are interested in hearing that weren't able to attend. And we hope to see you again this Tuesday, June 22nd at noon, when we welcome Down Home, North Carolina under the tent.